Good evening. I'm Joe McCarthy, Senior Associate Dean and Director of Degree Programs here at the Kennedy School. And it's my pleasure this evening to welcome you to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum and our first event of the spring term, entitled Peacekeeping, Can the UN Meet the Challenge? Before I go further, let me just note that immediately following the forum, our panelists have agreed to stay for a few minutes for a reception with the audience, and it will be held behind these curtains here. That is for a few minutes right after this evening's event. Peacekeeping and the UN's role seems to me to be an excellent way to begin this spring term here at the Institute of Politics Forum. Despite the myriad problems facing the world today, I also sense a certain season of hope. Maybe that's because I just came back 2 weeks ago from Washington, D.C. But there is this interesting juxtaposition of many problems facing this country and the world, and also a sense of hope, a sense that we can overcome these problems. And the UN, for me, has always been a repository of hope. When I was a boy in elementary school in the 1950s, I remember coming home in autumn afternoons to find that my mother would have the vacuum tube radio tuned to CBS, and it would be broadcasting narration of the General Assembly in New York, the whole thing. And people listened with rapt attention. We had great hopes for the UN. We still do. New nations were being rolled out constantly, post-colonial nations, names we hadn't heard, but it was exciting. And even in the midst of the Cold War, the UN served, certainly for many of us and for me, as a beacon. The first trip I ever made outside of my home without my family was on a train to New York to visit the UN headquarters on the East River. And the Sisters of Notre Dame thought that was more important than even going to St. Patrick's Cathedral, so that'll give you some sense of the importance that we attach to the UN. But this evening, we're going to talk about peacekeeping and the challenges facing peacekeeping, and they are many. And we have assembled a very good panel, and I'd like to warmly welcome them to the Kennedy School. Our moderator, Professor Baba, will introduce them individually in a moment. But before I go further, I would like to remind the panel that many of the audience tonight are our students. They come from across the United States and around the world, and almost all of them, I think, want to work for the UN, or certainly with the UN. So thank you for being with us this evening. Students, just a quick reminder, a little housekeeping here. Tomorrow, these are related events, tomorrow we will hold the International Development and Human Rights Career Fair in the Taubman building. The UN will be part of that, so please don't miss that. And the UN PIC, Professional Interest Council, has planned a number of events for this month, so watch the Kennedy School calendar for announcements of those events. Also, a thank you to Noelia Rodriguez and the team here at the Institute of Politics for partnering with us in putting on this event, and of course thanks to Sandy Hessler and her colleagues in the Office of Career Advancement. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator, Professor Jacqueline Baba. She is the Jeremiah Burke Jr. Lecturer in Law at the Harvard Law School and Director of the Harvard University Committee on Human Rights Studies, as well as a mainstay here at the Kennedy School's Carr Center for Human Rights. Prior to her academic career, Professor Baba was a human rights lawyer in London and at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Professor Baba has, as they say, walked the walk, and we are grateful to have her with us here this evening. Professor Baba.
Thank you very much, Dean McCarthy. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to welcome all of you, our visitors, but also all of you to this first, I think, really important session in the forum. Two contradictory observations are often made about what we call the international community, in quotation marks. On the one hand, it's often pointed out that when there's an emergency, despite all the talk of an international community, there really is no equivalent to a 999 number that you can call. The point being that international systems are slow, they're cumbersome, they're bureaucratic, they're mired in all sorts of complicated political self-interest. And Rwanda is, I guess, a classic example, but we may think that what recently happened in Gaza is another. So there is a sense, on the one hand, that when there are pressing emergencies, we don't do well. We, as an international community, don't do well. That's one point. The other point that's made about the international community, and I think it's also a powerful point by contrast, is that it's all too easy for member states of the UN to shove the most difficult problems of the day, of the week, of the month, of the year onto the United Nations, and then to scapegoat the United Nations for failing to do what they've actually prevented it from achieving. So there is a sense that the most intractable issues of our time, the most undesirable and tough jobs relating to those intractable issues, the thankless tasks, often end up on the UN's desk, so to speak. So I think we have these two sets of intuitions floating around. And I think there's no area of the international community's activities that better illustrates or highlights this paradoxical set of oppositions than what we call peacekeeping operations, which, as you will hear, many of you already know this, is a very diverse, expanding, and somewhat amorphous category, which captures a broad spectrum of interventions and covers some of the toughest international challenges of our time. Now, of course, we have to distinguish between various related terms, so I think it's important at the outset to make sure that we realize we're not talking about peacemaking, which is a strictly diplomatic concept that, of course, comes out of Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, and that can sometimes involve the International Court of Justice. And that usually takes place before UN military operations. We're talking about peacekeeping, the assumption being that we are talking about intervention authorized by the Security Council after a peace has, or at least a peace agreement or a ceasefire has been reached. So this isn't always the case. And I think it's for this reason that the famous UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld referred to peacekeeping as what he called a 6.5 operation, somewhere between Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. But anyway, peacekeeping is a fascinating area, and I think for all of us here at the Kennedy School, it touches on just about all the things that we learn and teach about, from issues of security and border control to issues of human rights and child protection, with a lot in between. Before I introduce the stellar panel that we're lucky to have with us, let me just conclude by making a couple of points. I think that many of us, when we think of peacekeeping, think of 4 basic concepts that must apply to all successful peacekeeping operations. And maybe this is something that we can come back to our panelists to talk about in the question period. One is a sense that UN peacekeeping must be impartial. Secondly, a sense that it must operate in situations of consent. Thirdly, and relatedly, that peacekeeping in some sense implies no aggressive use of force. It's peacekeeping, not peacemaking. And lastly, that peacekeeping operations have to have clear and feasible mandates. And I think to some extent, there certainly has been a sense that the more those 4 goals or those 4 concepts are realized, the more likely success in a peacekeeping operation is. But there is huge variation, as you'll hear, and the spectrum of problems and solutions is very broad. So let me now introduce our panel. Sitting immediately to my left is Susanna Malcorra, who is currently in the position of being the Undersecretary General in charge of the Department of Field Support, one of two departments created after the UN reform to deal with peacekeeping, a very senior position. And she has this position after a highly prominent career within the UN, where she was immediately prior to joining this department, the Deputy Executive Director, the number 2 person, basically, in the World Food Programme. But before her UN career, she worked for 25 years in the private sector, and her experience in the private sector included leadership positions both in IBM and in Telecom Argentina. So she, I think, is a wonderful example of somebody who brings to the UN the logistical and managerial and administrative skills from the private sector. Sitting next to Susanna is David Harland, who is the Director of the Europe and Latin American Division in the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations. Before this post, he was the acting Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General for Kosovo, a position he also held previously in East Timor. And he's also acted as Chief of Best Practices, the Chief of the Best Practices Unit within the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. He's also been involved in missions in Bosnia-Herzegovina. He has field experience in Asia and Africa. And like many of you, he is a Harvard graduate. And like some of you, perhaps, he has a Fletcher PhD. Sitting to David's left is Michael Gawett, who is the team leader of UNAMID, the United Nations African Union mission in Darfur, which is the largest peacekeeping mission in existence. He is based in New York, in the headquarters, and he is the liaison person for any high-level contact over Darfur. And he's also the head of one of the 5 integrated operational teams which provide a bridge between peacekeeping and the field support sections. He too is a Harvard graduate, and prior to the position that he currently holds, he was a senior political officer for the Department of Peacekeeping, specializing in Central Africa. He too has a varied and interesting background, which includes inter alia senior positions in Save the Children. I'd just like to take this opportunity to briefly introduce 2 other people who are sitting in the audience. One is Catherine Pollard. Pollard, if you wouldn't mind just standing for a second so people can see you, who is the Assistant, thank you, the Assistant Secretary General for Human Resources Management in the UN Secretariat. So she is, for those of you who really are interested in UN jobs, she is your target person. She is the senior person who is responsible, ultimately responsible for all senior recruitment, including recruitment for peacekeeping. And she was the Chief of Staff of the Peacekeeping Department with responsibility for implementing some of the reforms prior to this. And I can't see Adrian. Oh, right next to Catherine Pollard is Adrian Hills, who is Ms. Malcorra's special assistant, and he may also be someone who would be helpful for you to speak to. Okay, and I also would like to thank both Sandy Hessler and Jan Fischer, who is a Mason Fellow here, for the support and help that they provided to me in preparing for this evening's event. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to divide the questions that I ask into 2 bundles. The first is going to deal basically with content issues to do with peacekeeping, and the second, shorter section is going to deal with career issues, and then I'm going to turn it over to you for questions in our usual fashion in the forum. So, Susanna, I wonder if I could invite you first, please, just to give a brief overview of the scope of UN peacekeeping. I've said that it's varied and extensive, and perhaps you could introduce the audience to the scope of peacekeeping today, the nature of the engagements, the size of the operation, and so on.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here and to have the chance to take you through the incredible world of peacekeeping, and I'm probably the less prepared to do so because I have been in peacekeeping only for a few months. I arrived in May of last year as the head of the Department of Field Support. That gives me the advantage to have very fresh eyes into everything I'm going to say, so maybe that is an added value, but I'm sure colleagues to my left will be more prepared maybe to take you through the history and some of the challenges that peacekeeping has gone through and how we have gotten to the place where we are today. I put together a very short PowerPoint just to give you a sense of what is it that we are doing today. We have 18 peacekeeping operations at this very moment, and that doesn't count a very recent resolution from the Security Council that has created another model, not a peacekeeping operation, not a UN peacekeeping operation, but in Somalia we are going to be providing full support, full logistical support to the African Union mission there. So in a certain way, we are going to be half there, only on the support side, but adds yet another challenge to the variety of places and complexity of places where we are. And it's of course, very easy to see that our main operations are concentrated in Africa. Let me just give you a sense of figures here, because it is a number of people and resources that we manage that is equivalent to a very large international corporation. So we are talking about a budget that in the past biennium was in the level of 7.3. I can tell you I just introduced the budget for this biennium this past Monday, and it's $8.1 billion. So it's a huge, huge undertaking from a financial standpoint. When you talk about a number of people, we are talking about 120,000 people plus. And when you see the diversity of the people we deploy, given the complexity of mandates we have today, that really adds to our challenges. Just to give you a sense, we have more than 300 airplanes. We run really a large air company. And of course, we do it in places where sometimes no one else will land. So it's a very, very difficult and complex environment, not only from the political side, which colleagues will for sure be able to explain better than me, but also from the managerial side. You know, being able to create the infrastructure and the platform to allow for those troops to be deployed is something that is beyond what most of the large companies in this world will be ready to take. Just to give you a sense, these are the figures, and I'm not sure how clear that shows, but just gives you a sense of trend. After the 90s, where we had a dip in our size, given the problems and the crisis peacekeeping went through at that point in time, clearly ever since we have had a steady growth. And we have had a steady growth with what I will say, excellent results that retrofit into a spiral that got us to even a bigger growth. So we are, at this point in time, and this is very important to really take into consideration, we are suffering from the success that peacekeeping has had in the past decade. I mean, there have been essentially very, very good results around peacekeeping. Some peacekeeping operations have closed because of the excellent results that have been obtained. Some are in the process of being downsizing and probably closing in the next few years. Liberia comes to mind as a good example. And out of that, it becomes obvious that the peacekeeping tool is a very effective tool to address issues. So we are now under the pressure of a huge growth that, as it is the case with any organization, has to be managed and managing the growth itself is a challenge. Just to add to the growth question, I think numbers talk a lot, but don't say enough. And in that chart, you will see essentially what a peacekeeping operation was like some 10, 15 years ago, where the variety of tasks that were the responsibility for peacekeeping were very, very few and very concrete and very focused, while now we have a portfolio of responsibilities that is huge and that cuts across all types of areas that really make our challenge even bigger. You know, building the institutions, building the justice system, the whole rule of law question, the handling the process of the electoral process, human rights, protection of children, protection of civilians in general. So this brings to our size the additional difficulty of the depth and the variety of tasks that we are requested to do. And the fact that we are moving toward, we have moved towards a world of integrated missions, have added also the complexity of reaching out and dealing with the broad UN system, not only with our own peacekeeping world, which to a certain extent is self-contained and small, and also working very closely with the broader NGO community. So all of this adds and makes our business model one that has to be revisited and has to be adjusted and has to be brought to a new standard, because if we don't do that and if we don't do it properly, we may run into trouble and then we may get into a negative spiral because we are not delivering what we must deliver. Just to give you a very short message on what are the main issues that we have on our hands. Of course, some of them are related to the places where we work, and today our biggest problems are in the deployment of Darfur, and Mike is fully versed and involved and responsible for that. Chad is now something that is pretty much in our priorities, and we are taking over the European force, the European Union peacekeeping operation, so that's again something very, very big on our plate. And Somalia, as I mentioned at the beginning, is not yet, at least, the Security Council has not decided on a UN peacekeeping operation, but it has brought to our demands the fact that we have to support the African Union. On top of that, of course, we have the Congo, where we have to expand our footprint. We have Afghanistan, where we are also expanding. So a very, very large landscape and demands on strengthening our presence. Then clearly the fact that we have to deploy it in a timely manner. David and I were having a conversation coming to Boston, where we were talking about efficiency of peacekeeping, and we both agree that efficiency is important if you are effective. You cannot be efficient if you haven't been able to deliver on the mandate that you have been given. So we really need to sustain our effectiveness, the fact that we do have an impact, we do make a difference, and on top of that, we need to build, again, a new business model that allows us to become more efficient. And this is even more so true in the context of the financial crisis that the world is facing, where member states are putting pressure to really do more scrutiny on how funding is managed. You can go through all those challenges, and I think all of them will take us a long time, and I think we can discuss later. I would like to mention the last one, safety and security, because this is something that has also changed in the recent years. More and more so, the UN has become a target in itself. And more we are deploying in places where it is true, theoretically, there is a peace to keep, but that not necessarily is always like that. So we are caught in situations where the peace is not there. There is a long way to go in order to have that peace. And the UN in itself has become sort of a target. So trying to attract new talent, trying to attract people like you all who are interested in working in making a difference in this world, and at the same time creating an environment where you can all work, making sure that the safety and security of whoever is in the mission is preserved, has now become a center challenge for all of us. I will leave it there. I think it's good for my colleagues to chip in, and we'll be ready to answer later on.
Thank you very much indeed. So I think that's a great place to start this sort of overview. And what I wanted to do is to sort of pick up really on what you were saying, and maybe to ask you, David, to talk a bit about what you consider to be the greatest successes, or give us a couple of examples of really successful peacekeeping interventions and why they've been successful. What is it about them that could be replicated? What are the lessons that you think that the UN's learned from these successful cases?
Great, thanks. And first of all, it's a kind question, because the question is usually the opposite one.
I'm reserving that for myself.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, first of all, I think Tajikistan, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Namibia, there is a fairly long record of happy results to peacekeeping missions. And I must say your introductory spiel is excellent. The success criteria, or whether or not you can firmly predict in advance that a mission will be successful, does depend very much on how close you are to precisely those criteria. I would just add one more. You said impartiality, consent, the non-use of force except in self-defense. Another one is unity of the Council, the unity of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. The missions that are most successful, I mean, when I think of, countries transformed from El Salvador to, say, Mozambique, countries that were in an awful state, and then we have been there, and by good luck or something that we were able to contribute to, they have been on a path which we've been able to see now for quite a long time, is a path to a sustainable, prosperous peace. Those have the 3 things you mentioned, but they also have the Council behind them. And I have to say, the biggest indicator of difficulty is almost certainly that the Council is divided among itself. The UN was set up in 1945, actually not to do peacekeeping at all, and not to resolve conflicts among itself. It's entirely, I mean, weirdly, it's set up as an alliance, really to squash Germany and Japan if they try it again. I mean, that's more. There is Article 107. I don't know if anybody has a UN charter in front of them, but Article 107 says you can invade Germany and Japan anytime you want, as long as you tell the Security Council. It's a very odd. I mean, everybody thinks of the UN as peaceniks and lovables, but it's actually meant for something quite different. And it certainly doesn't have any reference to peacekeeping. And it basically has no mechanism for dealing with problems among the 5 victorious powers of World War II. And the classic example for me, I mean, because I'm the director of operations in Europe and the Americas, but the classic one for me is, to preempt you on some of the difficult ones, are the missions in the former Yugoslavia, where essentially what is playing out is a dispute between the Russians and the Chinese, usually on one side, and the Brits, French, and Americans to some extent on the other side. So when I go through the Tajikistans, Cambodias, Sierra Leones, Liberias, El Salvadors, Guatemalas, the happy stories, I essentially see consent. Consent comes in many shapes and forms and doesn't have to be very full, but it has to be there. I see impartiality. Impartiality, however, has to be the impartiality of a referee. It can't be the impartiality of the person who doesn't care that somebody is getting mugged on their watch. I see the non-excessive use of force. Force is just one of the instruments that can be borne. I see the unity of the Council, and I don't know whether it's a subject Susanna's going to come back to, but also there has to be some sort of match between the aspirations of the Council, even if they are united, and the capacities they're willing to deploy. More and more, I think, I mean, I'm a relative pessimist on UN peacekeeping for the coming, I mean, like Moody's, I think I've got it on a cell. I think the Council is going through a phase of saying, Mike, please fix Darfur. You can have 26,000 troops. But there's no way for Mike to actually get the 26,000 troops. There's also no way to get the 26,000 troops into Darfur, because the consent of the government isn't there and there's no political will to fight them in. So I would say, to end it, that your original list characterizes all of the successful missions, plus no major disagreement between the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, and some minimal willingness of the Security Council and the wider General Assembly to provide the resources that are necessary to meet the very high aspirations that are out there.
So David, can I just press you on one thing, which is, I think the fourth element of my little sort of checklist was a clear and feasible mandate. And I think that's interesting, because that, in a sense, means that the UN powers that be, Security Council, have to prefigure before the operation even starts what the denouement is going to be. It's a sort of clear-sightedness, which is a high demand. It's a tough thing to require. And yet, of course, if you don't have that sort of clarity, if you don't have some element of realism, as you say, some sort of matching between the wish list and the kind of tools, instruments you have, then you're going to be in trouble. So is it the case that the successful missions that you referred to, was it the unity of the Security Council, or was it the relative transparency of the solution, or are those two things very closely related? In other words, having a clear mandate and a feasible, a match between the goals and the instruments seems to, does that reflect just some political situations and not others? Is it a political question? Is it what determines that? Because it seems to me that's a very crucial element. When you have a confused mandate just all over the place, lots of different things, much, much harder to deliver on that.
A clear mandate, it's never an intellectual problem. The clarity, well, hardly ever. The clarity flows from the degree of political will. And the degree of political will is a function of two things. It's a function of whether or not the Council is united, and whether in their unity they're committed to getting a result. In fact, they don't have to be engaged. I would say in Mozambique, which was a very happy operation, a very successful operation, bringing to a close an awful, awful, awful conflict. The Council just said, go for it, do as you want. And one of the great things about working for the UN is, bizarrely more than in any modern organization you can imagine, you're basically on your own once you're out there.
Until you screw up.
Until you screw up. But if it is wrongly conceived at the beginning, or if the Council is divided among itself and is actively blocking solutions that you are proposing, a classic one is whether or not places aspiring to independence will be granted that independence. If you can know that in advance, like in Timor, then you may have your ups and downs, but you will get there in the end. If you can't know that because the Council can't decide, like, say, Kosovo right now, it's going to be an incredibly hard slog. So I would say clarity is important, but in fact clarity, the Security Council, I work for the Security Council, so I mustn't say anything too bad about it, but clarity is not the greatest of its virtues. I mean, its currency is the greater the problem, the greater you elevate the level of ambiguity. And sometimes, frankly, that is the cause of the most awful tragedies. So, I mean, just to give a famous example, in Srebrenica, the Western members of the Council felt that the UN should go there and defend them. Several members of the Council, actually a blocking minority, almost a majority, felt they shouldn't go there at all. In the end, and the Secretariat said it could defend them if they had 36,000 troops. In the end, they reached a compromise and said you can have 7,000 troops, and you can't defend them, but you can deter attacks on them by your presence. Now, what does it mean to deter an attack by your presence? Are you allowed to shoot at somebody if he crosses the line or not? So, yes, you're absolutely right. Clarity is essential, and essentially clarity is something you will almost never get. And when you do get it, success in the mission is almost guaranteed.
Thank you. Michael, you are the sort of, you have the challenging and maybe unenviable job
You can say
of being
victim. It's okay with me.
of being the team leader for the mission in Darfur, which I think many of us here is a situation we've watched with frustration, despair, anger, depression over the past years. I wouldn't want to say this is an example of failure, but it's certainly a very good case study in the extraordinary political challenges of intervention. Could you just tell us a bit more about that and tell us what you think? For example, David alluded to this already, this question of the mismatch between what the UN and the 5 members of the security permanent members decided was available in terms of troops and what maybe they knew would actually be available ultimately. You know, how does that happen? How do you deal with that? Is there a way around it? What do you think about that?
Oof. I'd probably start by tweaking your criteria, maybe simplifying it a bit. And I would say that in my experience and in my observation, for these things to work, you indeed need consent. And ideally that consent has to come in the form of some sort of agreement amongst those who are creating the conflict on how to resolve it, some rough agreement. You need a doable plan on how to sustain that agreement. And then you need sustained support, and not just of the Council, but of anybody who's in a position to cause trouble. And certainly in the case of Darfur, that figures large. So you need consent and a framework, a doable plan and resources, and you need sustained political support at the top level, but also in the neighborhood. And I think Darfur is a perfect storm of failing to tick any of those boxes. And we can start with a consent box. It's a funny thing talking about Darfur because we spill so much ink in the New York Times. I know audiences like this have a high level of sophistication. You don't know where to start. But it's important to remember that we initially wanted to roll in with a UN operation. The government said no. It had to be a UN-AU operation. And then the Security Council said, we'll go in anyway. And some of us said, we'll go in to do what? And they said, to implement the agreement. And then we said, what agreement? And they said, the agreement that's completely on the rocks and failed. So right away, there's no framework. And there's consent, but it's badly compromised, right? So you don't meet the first criteria. Second criteria is a doable plan. You talked about this, but it's an oxymoron, I guess. How can you have a doable plan when there's no agreement on the framework for getting to a constructive end state anyway? So you don't meet the second criteria. And then the third, you implied this quite explicitly, but the third criteria is having the tools in the box to implement the plan. And you see it becomes more and more ridiculous as you go along. There's no framework, therefore how can you implement it? And now we're talking about the tools to implement an unimplementable framework that doesn't exist. And it sounds comical, but in fact it's deeply, deeply tragic. So in the case of Darfur, indeed, we say we need all these wonderful things to do this job that's undoable, but the things don't come. We have 10,000 troops, not 26.
Why?
I'll come to that, because that's part of the fix. Yeah, we have no helicopters that can shoot bad guys. We need 18. We have no helicopters that can drop people into a a hot zone, we need 24. We just don't have anywhere close to the tools required to do this job that's not doable to begin with. So where do you start? Well, I think you'll hear this a lot, certainly from David and I, but none of it will go anywhere unless the guys passing the resolution really invest in it happening. And if, in my view, and mindful of the fact that this is going to the web and we do all work for the council, in my view, I'm not quite sure how you can deploy a mission to do something that prima facie is impossible, or that you're asking them to do something in an environment that hasn't even been described yet. There's no
explicit.
there's no peace agreement in Darfur. We're deployed to implement a peace agreement. Yeah, so I'm not sure how that can happen. And the complicating factor in Darfur, which I mentioned, is it's not just a question of, an honesty and forthrightness in the council, but each of the powerful on the council have I won't say client states, but they have friends, all of whom have friends in the region, all of whom are in a position to make this more or less difficult. And if you study Darfur closely, you'll see that people in the neighborhood don't have a sustained interest in this thing working either. So you hear about I'll be very specific, you hear about rebel movements being funded by neighboring countries. You hear about some of the neighboring countries deploying troops into the mission with an agenda to actually support one side or the other. It's an absolute dog's breakfast.
Am I allowed to
Please.
say, on the brink of being very naughty to our masters, that there is a morbid dynamic at play in the Security Council, which is a fact of life, an awful fact of life if you work for the UN, right? Which is that, in fact, they don't stumble into this problem and say, oh my goodness, there isn't any consent, and oh my goodness, we asked for 26,000 troops and they didn't turn up. The mics of this world are actively saying, but there's no peace agreement, there are no troops available, even if they were available, you don't have the consent of the government. You can either take everything through Khartoum with the consent of the government, in which case you make deep compromises, awful ones, or you can fight it through, in which case you need a whole different approach. They all know that, but they are themselves faced with political processes which require them to do something about Darfur.
But let me jump in here and say that I feel, and remember Susanna's slide, the graph, we had the big drop and then the big rise, and I'm not a chartist and I'm not good with my money, but it seems to me we're due for a correction.
Massively.
And my observation is that, and this is indiscreet, but my observation is the Council is less knowledgeable, or those that end up deploying these missions are, dare I say, less knowledgeable than they were when we were climbing out of that trough about what's required for success. And they're more willing to force through operations that have all odds against them. And I'm not sure that when Lakhdar Brahimi was being forthright with the Council about what it takes for a mission to succeed, I'm not sure if that Council would have cut the resolution for this Darfur mission. Because, let's say 10 years ago or 8 years ago, Kofi Annan and others had done a good job to make it clear to the world that if you want success, you must meet these criteria. That discourse is lost. And it's remarkable to me to see, even over the last 5 years, that the minimum requirements for these things to be successful are more or less set aside. And I speak as a private citizen and as a Canadian citizen, so I'm getting Susanna off the hook here. But for me, there's this, the ante is up. Darfur, oh my gosh, no criteria met. Chad, oh my gosh, no criteria met. Somalia, oh my gosh, no criteria met. And I would say, and let me be direct about it so my mother would understand it, it's worse in each case. And I think we're slipping farther and farther away from what we understand as the universe of the credible in terms of these things being effective.
So can I just, I don't quite understand this, because many of us here are critical of the Security Council for not being bold enough and not being interventionist enough. But what you seem to be saying is they're actually being irresponsible, they're being too bold, because they're pushing and setting out an agenda which is actually, for you who are, on the ground trying to implement it, it's not possible. So they should be more cautious, they should be more circumspect. Is that what you're saying?
And we'll swing it back to the positive. I can see Susanna's ire rising here. Our message will be the irreplaceability of this tool. and the enormously and even profound importance of this tool, but it is a question of using the tool for the appropriate job. You know, and if you have a wrench, you don't use it to bang nails. And I think we're finding ourselves in a position where we're being asked to use our wrench to bang nails. And if you do that long enough, the wrench breaks.
And don't bite off more than you can chew. And the analog to Mike's joke about I'm not being a chartist and not good with money, the analog to the financial crisis is actually quite good. What is happening in peacekeeping is it has gone through a decade of expansion, massive expansion, and after a very unhappy period in the mid-1990s, has had a string of very important successes that have made the Council use it more and more. And it shifts more and more risk over to the countries that are providing the troops. And it's also issuing more and more bad paper. It's saying, you will protect the citizens of Eastern Congo, and we're not going to provide a single soldier to do it. So I would have to agree with Mike that the mismatch between the overreach of the Security Council in the statements of its ambitions and the available capacities is classically a bubble waiting to burst and to bring about a very unhappy result. Whether it will turn out to be Darfur or Somalia or Eastern Congo, I don't know. But that bubble is very fat.
Susanna.
Well, let me try and bring a perspective from somebody who doesn't have a long history. I think what we are seeing is a dynamics that is the reflection of the dynamics of the world today. I mean, part of the problem is that for many reasons, and I'm sure some of you could explain those reasons much better than me, the international players somehow ended up with a toolbox that was much more reduced than the one that was present some years ago. And the space that they gave each other to play within the toolbox was also more reduced. So at the end of the day, you find yourself cornered because the problem is there and many inflexibilities have been built into the system and players don't know how to find a solution. So that's the moment where I think the UN and peacekeeping within the UN comes as the last resort that you can use to at least give yourself the chance to maybe find a solution. Much of this should be reframed if the international community starts a different dialogue and opens up different space. And then probably part of that will become in a manner that the Security Council, and not only the Security Council, the troop contributors and the police contributors will have a say and a way of being part of it that will then get us into designs that are more shared. Part of the problem is sharing the design. And one of the things I mentioned when I took you through my short PowerPoint is that not only we have many more operations much larger, but they have many mandates. And that takes you to the point that David was making, that it's not only a matter of financial resources, which are huge, it's also the profile of the assets that you need and the profile of the military you need and the police you need and the correctional people you need. So I think there has to be, and there will be, I'm an optimistic, there will be an evolution when the landscape gets a little bit broader and the dialogue is a little bit more open. But at the end of the day, not being from the UN for a long time, coming from the private sector, what I will also say is that at least the UN is there to try and do something. And it's true that in Darfur we are far from perfect. It's true that our deployment is far behind. It's only 60%, and our power is even less than that. But it's also true that last week, when the problems took place in Mugajeria, and the people were caught in the middle, one of the key reasons why people were able to cross that bridge is because we had a contingent there and could play a role in the negotiations. And at the end of the day, the rebels withdrew, and people, for the time being, were able to pass those few very, very difficult days. So as imperfect as it is, I still believe is something that is a tool that can play a role.
Let me just ask my last question on the content before we move on to the more career-oriented part of our conversation. And that is really picking up on what actually all of you said about the instruments you have, the manpower. Let me just talk about military manpower, person power, but it is essentially manpower. There's been a discussion about whether the UN should have its own army of blue helmets for as long as I can remember. And I think several of you have alluded to the problems in getting troops. And I know that even when you do have troops, there is often concern about the quality of the troops. And it's not a secret that many of the nations that supply troops to the UN are nations with less well-trained troops than those that don't supply.
Those that send them.
Right. And so my question really is, what's the solution to this problem? Is there a solution? Is it just a question of logistics that given that I gather that the UN pays about $1,000 a month per soldier, this is only an attractive deal for poorer countries, it's not an attractive deal for richer countries? Is that kind of what's driving this? Or is it that there isn't sufficient political will to really create an effective military force so that the UN really could be effective for reasons of geopolitical power broking? What's the solution to this problem? How do you see? Maybe we start with Michael and
I'll be parochial, and I'll answer your question from the side and talk about what we can do. What I've noticed as a guy who came to peacekeeping 5 years ago is that our planners are all NATO chaps. And they go in and they plan these spectacular gold-plated missions. And it seems to me there's this disconnect between that exercise and the realization that the chaps who are going to be deployed are from Bangladesh and Nigeria and other places. So on Darfur, I see this spectacular big hands, small map plan of attack helicopters and battalions and blah, 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 blah. And it's all very NATO-centric, and for the military guys in the audience, it's all about expeditionary forces. That's not what we have at our disposal. And I think we can do a smarter job of planning operations and creating tactics that give us a better chance of deploying an effective force rather than expecting to be able to roll out a cookie-cutter kind of NATO operation. So we need to adapt somehow. If my military planning colleagues are here, they disagree with me, but I feel quite strongly about it.
Yeah, I also think, I mean, first of all, it's true what you say about quality of troops. On the other hand, I think doctrinally, I think we've done some things that actually make our operations more likely to succeed when brute force alone doesn't succeed. When the United States invaded Iraq, there was an article by Richard Pearl in The Guardian, Thank God for the Death of the UN. And it was a great article, and it was making the point that we're going to show that you can do some things much better unilaterally and just with brute force. And I think, I mean, obviously there's now a sense that for all the frustrations of multilateralism, there are extreme limits to this simple unilateral application of a pure sharp-end force instrument. And I think in our capacity to bring troops, police, electoral, humanitarian, plus a degree of international legitimacy, plus a developmental agenda, a constitutional process, a political reconciliation process, has in fact more capacity to stabilize a country emerging from conflict than simply providing 3 divisions of NATO troops. So that's the first thing I would say. The other thing I would say, so first is a slightly defensive one. The offensive one is that when a country or a place is dysfunctional, there is a spectrum of stuff that the slow-moving, correctly identified as slow-moving international community can do, from the one end of the spectrum, which is the Red Cross goes there and tries to hand out something in hopes that everybody will let them do that. And the other end is you send a really big, really nasty military force. Now, the dilemma that the UN finds it in is the countries which have the capacity to do the last. And the last thing is presumably something you should only do when you're invaded or when there is a genocide actually in process. It takes an enormous amount of political will and an enormous amount of money. But those same countries are the permanent members of the Security Council, and they control the instrument which allows you to send a rather weaker expression of international will, which is a peacekeeping force. And frankly, a peacekeeping force of any sort, but particularly staffed with the types of people we have and so on, and moving at the pace it does, is not an appropriate response to an ongoing genocide. So for me, you have correctly identified a structural deformation in the architecture of the Security Council. The solution is the Americans should provide some troops.
Suzanne, on this question of troops, I mean, and multilateral interventions, is there also more of a role for the private sector? What could the private sector do to assist? It's been pointed out that many of the places where peacekeeping happens are the places where there are huge corporate interests and operations. Is there something that can be done, more that can be done to promote collaboration, to encourage corporate intervention, you know, to encourage companies to look corporately responsible in this way? Do you think there's more that we could do in this area?
Well, first of all, I really believe that we need to revisit the model in which we operate. Our business model needs to be revisited. And in fact, we have started some thinking within ourselves, but we are also having some dialogue with member states, with the Security Council. There is a need to fix part of the problems you were referring to, and Mike and David were referring to. And sometimes things are not on-off, are not whether you have all troops from one side or the other side. You know, you can have search capacity, standby capacity. You can have technology being shared in a manner that brings some of the troops to a different standard. The level of technology we utilize is so low that you cannot believe it. And to me, that's a huge difference. It is true that you need a certain profile of troops for certain occasions, but if you have the right technology, you probably can do much more than what we do today with the troops we have. So there is something in the model that has to be tackled. Going to your point of the private sector, first of all, private sector is already present in peacekeeping missions. One thing that one needs to be always reminded of, and I do that all the time, is that we have a military deployment done through a civilian means. I mean, our logistics to deploy is a civilian logistics. We don't storm into a country. We go through customs, we have our shipments clear, we go through all the forms. I mean, and that's one way to disable, not enable our deployments. You know, sometimes the processes take so long that, you know, it takes you forever to be there. But we use absolutely a strong contractual arrangements with big companies, smaller companies. One of the things I believe we must do better is to procure with a sense of, yes, some should come from international market, but some should be very, very targeted to the local and the regional market, because that in itself creates a model that is a development model. And, you know, the level of resources we deploy in some of the places where we are make a huge difference. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, yes, there is an opportunity to have a stronger engagement. The UN in general is very, very suspicious of the private sector, and that has to be worked out. And I think the private sector needs to recognize that there is a certain approach and a certain way of doing business if you are willing to engage with the UN. But that's part of what we have to do.
Okay, so now let me just quickly turn one question about what do you look for? Maybe this involves you too, Catherine. What do you look for when you're thinking about a good peacekeeper? What is the skill set that those of our students and people who are in the audience should be developing if they really want to participate? What are the tools at a high level that you're really looking for? Does anybody want to jump in?
Well, I think basically we require bright, smart people. So you all can pass that. You can pass that filter, I think. The type of business we are in is a very difficult business, and the people who need to be there are people who can manage nuances, who can manage not black and whites. You know, having been in the corporate world, this is a much more sophisticated business to be in. It's a business where you need very strong interpersonal skills. Things are never black or white. So being able to set your record straight, stick to the charter, to the principles and values that the charter establishes, but at the same time be able to open up the space that is required for you to do your job is critical, and for me that is the main point that is required from any peacekeeper.
Anybody want to add anything?
I'd like to, from having lived it a little bit. I think in addition to what Suzanne said, let's leave aside the technical. You must have the languages. If you're a finance person, you must know the spreadsheet. Don't bother us if you don't, and there's nothing wrong with having a high standard. But the other, I think maybe one or two elements that will not only make one successful in the business, but also allow one to survive, are, I think, first, a fairly deep vein of organic empathy. And then second, and this will sound a little trite, but you have to have a fairly solid moral fiber, and I'll explain both. If you're out in one of these operations, you can at any given moment be the 26-year-old kid driving the UN vehicle at the checkpoint, being stopped by the drunk checkpoint guy with his old Armenian AK-47 who has a problem with the way you dress or something. And if you can't find a way to see things through his eyes a little bit, you will have a problem. Multiply that up to a decision about going to war or not that the guy leading the UN operation has to make with the head of that rogue state. You have to be able to understand or empathize with the interlocutor. The morality or the moral fiber thing I point to because if you're out there in a peacekeeping operation, you are by definition a leg or two up in the unspoken power relationship with these people. You're visiting a place that's badly dysfunctional, probably in great distress, where people's prospects and futures are deeply uncertain, and you're rocking in there making all your money, about to take a break and go to the Maldives or whatever. And it creates all sorts of temptations to not behave appropriately. And I mean that in the full gamut. So for me, in addition to the technical stuff, you need to know empathy, and you need to have a fairly solid moral core, or you'll make trouble.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, well, why don't we thank you very much and turn over to the questions from the audience. So please line up. There are 4 mics. And you, I think, probably all know the rules, which is you please identify yourself. Please make your question concise and clear, and please make sure that it is a question. So please, sir, go ahead.
My name is Michael Brower. I came to Harvard 60 years ago to try to learn how to create a strong UN and world peace, and I must say we haven't made much progress. I have a question for the panel which you probably can't answer, so I'm going to start with a question to those of us in the audience. Those of us who are U.S. citizens, what can and should we do to get our country to give up this incredibly crazy resort to military solutions which are not solutions and starve the United Nations? What can we do to make our country responsible as a member of the world community? Many of you are not citizens of the United States. What can you do when you go back to your country to help create a truly effective United Nations and a world civilization? My question to the panel, and this is difficult for you, so if you don't have much to say, I don't blame you. I salute you. You are doing God's work in a world of, of the devil. You work for the United Nations, so you have to be careful what you say. What is your advice to us, especially us American citizens? How can we get the United States to give up our extreme nationalism, our arrogance, our resort to military solutions, our spending half our budget on our own military and starving the United Nations?
Thank you. I'll take one more question, and then I'll give the panel a minute to think about the answers. Yes, please go ahead.
I'm an MPP here at the Kennedy School. My question is actually about hybrid peacekeeping forces. And so, Michael, it probably pertains more to you because my experience is with UNIMID.
Can you stand a little closer to the
Sure.
microphone?
Can you hear better?
Yes, better.
So this is more directly aimed at UNIMID. I don't know if there are any other hybrid peacekeeping forces within the UN, but I was wondering what you think about that model in general. And it's been a year since I've been on the ground in Sudan, but working with the two mediation teams under Jan Eliasson and Salim, they were on very different pages in terms of how the peace process was supposed to play out. And my understanding is that that was throughout UNIMID as a whole. So it's been a year. I was wondering if some of those kinks have been worked out and what are some lessons learned or some positive things from that model that you would take forward for the UN's work and other missions.
Thank you. Okay, so let's start with you, Michael, this time.
The UN is an imperial organization. The SG is at the top, and hierarchy is key. I am therefore the most expendable on the panel, and will, as a result, maybe respond to the first question just a little bit to say that and indeed I have the longest unprotected border and so on, but the U.S. does spend. And they would tell us this on a weekly basis. And they invest heavily in these peacekeeping operations. You can argue that it's for reasons that aren't completely pure, but 27 cents out of every peacekeeping dollar comes from the U.S. My experience has been, and this will sound ridiculous, but leaving aside the wrong-headed nature of the whole project of UNIMID, the Americans have put their shoulder to the wheel, and they have made an effort. And I think, and Susanna, I speak under your control, but I think we are where we are. Well, we've made the progress we've made partly because of their pushing. And I'm not talking about Clooney and the slim fast advocacy. I'm talking about guys in government trying to find ways to move Rwandans more quickly from Rwanda to Darfur. So indeed, there are all sorts of reasons to critique Uncle Sugar, but I also think we need to be aware of the efforts the Americans have made with regard to UNIMID. Shall I do this one as well, or do you want to make a comment, Susanna? Yeah, okay. Oh, kinks. Because we don't have much time, I will stop speaking with my hands, and I will tell you that there are two major problems that you know about because you were there that haven't gone away and won't go away in this hybrid operation. The first is the inequality of the partnership. You know, the analogy I like to draw is that there are about 700 people in New York working on peacekeeping operations, and at one point there were 4 in Addis Ababa working for the African Union. That gives the lie to the notion that this is actually a partnership, and it creates some very serious problems, the most obvious of which are that the AU has this expectation to be an equal partner, have an equal voice, but they just don't have the leverage to play that role. It's deeply frustrating for them. Our problem is that this is a $1.5 billion mission. The Secretary General is liable for it. It's his operation because the body charged with international peace and security has given him this job. So it's his credit card. But the AU is expecting to have a say in, you know, what he uses it in. It's a very difficult thing. The other major problem is politics, and let me just distill this down to a single issue, the ICC. We have a fixed line. It will run its course, due process, justice, but also peace, to paraphrase badly. The African Union line is very different. It's Article 16 now. You're wrong to put Bashir in the crosshairs. Tough to reconcile those two positions in two organizations that are supposed to be having the same vector and goal in one area. So the kinks are not worked out. And they may work out over time, but it's hard to say.
Let me try and say a couple of things on the two questions. On the questions on the question on the U.S., I come from Argentina. So it would be very, very arrogant for me to give advice to the US citizens, because we don't necessarily use and relate to the UN as we should. So I think this is a little bit of a broader question than just the US. Is the international community taking seriously their commitment to the UN and using the UN as the tool to enable solutions? And they come and go, and there are different moments. I personally believe that we are heading towards a time where there may be an opportunity. That's why I talked earlier on of a bigger sandbox and people playing together a little bit better without being naive in that regard. But particularly, and David mentioned this, because some of the unilateral engagements have proven unsuccessful. So everything comes in cycles, So again, I think we do have an opportunity before us, but we as citizens, from wherever we come from, need to make the point clear. And the citizens of this country are quite divided on this issue. So unless the citizens make it clear to their leaderships, it will never happen. And same is in my country. So I think it is very important that we use this counter cycle that seems to be ahead of us to prove that we are ready to deliver. And there comes the second point that relates to the hybrid and to what Mike said. One of the major problems I believe the UN has is that in some instances it's arrogant. And I think the UN is such a big and important institution and plays such a critical role that it has to be very humble in playing it. And it's true that the AU is a partner that doesn't have equal footing from a capacity standpoint, but I also think that taking the time and investing the time to play to the extent possible, across the table, helps the AU raise and maybe build some capacity, but also helps us understand better the problems that the region has from their own eyes. So probably because I come from a neck of the wood that is somehow distant from the UN, and because I have been away from the UN most of my life, I really value the opportunity the UN brings for different parties, even if they have different sizes, to work together, and the UN has to be mindful of that.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm going to take these two questions now.
Cooper, I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. This is a question for David Harland. You spoke of your pessimistic outlook for peacekeeping in the future. I was wondering whether you believe that any of the reasons for that are geopolitical. Are you, for example, concerned that the rising power of Russia and China and their the increasing popularity of their views on sovereignty and intervention will shape peacekeeping negatively in the future?
Thank you.
I'm a graduate student here. I want to ask about the responsibility to protect. And the Secretary General just released his report on the responsibility to protect, and I think part of the purpose was to expand the toolbox that the UN and member states had to respond to some of these conflict situations. So what impact do you think the debate on the responsibility to protect is going to have on the peacekeeping model?
Thank you. David?
Well, the first question is an interesting one. The pessimism is relatively narrowly focused. In fact, when I was thinking about our first, Mr. Brower's question, 60 years of frustration about what the UN has and hasn't been allowed to do. In the last 20 years, it has been allowed to grow peacekeeping from being an absolutely marginal instrument to being the primary instrument for the management of armed conflict in the world today. And as it has done so, armed conflict has declined. And in fact, the places it goes show better long-term sustainable peace rates than places it doesn't go. So the broad story for me is not altogether pessimism. My pessimism mainly relates to the instrument as being overused. The drivers of that are not principally geopolitical. In fact, I think the particular problem of overreach is more of a problem in the highly democratic societies, where politicians feel a need to do something because there are very well-intentioned people who want to do something, and they want to do the something naturally on the cheap, and it's the UN that becomes there. So the geopolitical problems you raise are real ones, but in my view they're not the principal drivers of the issue. And that is very much related to our responsibility to protect. Responsibility to protect is a classic case of where we can easily overreach, and in my view you shouldn't assert the principle at all unless you are willing to resource it. We have this awful situation now in Eastern Congo, where the Council is saying, and the French Foreign Minister is writing articles in the newspaper saying, you must protect these people. The world has been willing to give the same size of peacekeeping force to Congo as it gave to Kosovo. Congo is 250 times the size of Kosovo, and 350 times as many people have died. If you create very high expectations, they will fail. So we have to be very careful with responsibility to protect.
Okay, I think we'll make this our last question. Oh, okay, we'll make 2 more questions and that's it.
My name is Dan Enerson. I'm a visiting student from Brandeis University. My question actually has to do with MONUC in the DRC. The role of MONUC has often been criticized as being ambiguous and largely ineffectual, this being despite having a very robust mandate. I was wondering if you could address these criticisms and why MONUC has largely been marginalized in the recent joint initiative between Rwanda and the DRC to eradicate the FDLR, which is a part of MONUC's mandate.
Okay.
My name's Jo Reid. I'm at Physicians for Human Rights.
Can you get a little bit closer?
My name's Jo Reid. I'm at Physicians for Human Rights in the Sudan team. And again, I wanted to direct a question to Michael. I was interested in what you were saying as regards UN AMID and the extent to which you're going to be able to fulfill the ideas behind UN AMID. And whilst we've all seen the problems that AMID had that have been taken on by UN AMID again, I think when people are looking at what they define as success in Darfur, at least at the end of the day, have you helped more than when you started off at the beginning of the day? People think about protecting people who are in the camps. And when we look at the upwards of 3 million people who, because of other problems, aren't getting the food they need, or not the right kind of food, etc., we're still seeing a peacekeeping problem. The people aren't safe in the camps, either from attacks or from, particularly when the camps are in Chad now, they're not safe from areas that are just not rebel groups as much as locals as well. There aren't firewood patrols. People do have to leave the camps, and they're not safe when they do. And is that something that, even though UN AMID isn't able to work because there isn't a peace agreement in the way that we would ultimately want it to, how can we address the day-to-day security issues that UNHCR aren't able to deal with, NGOs aren't able to deal with? Why have we not been able to make further progress on that? Thanks.
MONUC. Allez.
MONUC, but to go back to my little Kosovo now, there were several hundred times more NATO troops per square kilometer in Kosovo, and they were unable to stop either the reverse ethnic cleansing of 1999 or the 2004 spasm of violence. There is no military solution, no realistic military solution to the problems of Congo. In my view, MONUC has done very well. First of all, it has created a legitimate election. It's run the world's most bizarre, most sprawling, most fabulously successful election with ID cards being printed, generators being dropped by helicopters, people being registered on pirogues that come up tiny canoes. It's fabulous. There is no way in which it's going to crush the armies. There are 17,000 troops and probably 500,000 armed people in Congo. It's done relatively well, I think, at protecting civilians when there have been threats of imminent genocide, like in Bunia in 2003 and thereafter. I think the UN and the other great powers that are involved in trying to stitch up a deal at the moment to deal with the Rwanda-Congo slash Hutu-Tutsi problem is all to be supported. And I think that there is a good role for MONUC there. So I'm relatively pro-MONUC, but I'm relatively, and think it's done a lot, but I would affirm that there is no military solution, even if MONUC were much, much, much bigger than it is.
On Sherry's question, there are three parts to my answer. I'll do the business school thing with you. The first part is that, and my military colleagues will be proud of me for saying this, in military terms, you can't function until you're deployed. And we are burning most of our calories, as the Americans say, to get stood up. And it's just a fact. Part one. Part two, that's not good enough because of what's happening and because of our obligation, professional, moral, and so on, to try and do something. So as we have been getting stood up, we have been making efforts to try and do what you're describing, which is kind of in an ad hoc fashion, making life a little more difficult for the bad guys. And the pattern has been that off the back of some spike in conflict or some trauma, we have made the case for our utility and then established a precedent. So there was that slaughter in Kalma camp. Suddenly it provoked us, and it made it difficult for the government to prevent us from being in Kalma camp for 24 hours. It's a precedent. When we've deployed more people, we'll roll them out to the other camps. Muhajiria, we stayed. It was a passive form of protection, but it was a valid form of protection, and we'll continue to build this way even as we deploy. The third piece of the answer, Sherry, is that that's all well and good. That has nothing to do with a solution. It has nothing to do with a solution. It has a lot to do with, as I said, making life difficult for the bad guys, reducing the suffering of the people who've already suffered immeasurably. It won't bring them home. It won't result in a peace agreement, and it won't end the war in Darfur. Thanks.
On that optimistic note, let me thank our panel very, very much indeed for coming and for sharing your expertise, and really commend you for the clarity and the concision with which you gave your answers. So thank you. And those of you who would like to informally meet the panel, please do so afterwards. Thank you very much.